One signature erased $400 billion. Not in a crash, not in a scandal, not because of fraud, betrayal, or a missed payment. A man looked at a young computer company, saw a dangerous contract, and chose safety over a future empire. His name was Ronald Wayne, and for 12 days, he owned 10% of Apple Computer Company. Then, he sold it for $800 and later signed away the remaining claims for another $1,500. Total payout, $2,300. Decades later, that same slice would be worth hundreds of billions on paper, with Apple near a $4 trillion market value. But the cruelest part is not that he left. It is that, at the time, leaving looked completely rational. So what did Ronald Wayne see that Steve Jobs refused to fear? Spring 1976. Ronald Wayne was 41 years old, working at Atari in Sunnyvale as a chief draftsman. His job was exacting and unglamorous. He designed arcade machine cabinets, checked drawings, reviewed details, and made sure sloppy work did not leave the building. Around Atari, Wayne had a reputation for caution. He read paperwork carefully, he noticed risks others missed. He trusted documents more than excitement. That was not paranoia. That was experience. 5 years earlier, in 1971, Wayne had launched a small company making slot machines for the Nevada market. It collapsed within a year. The failure left him owing money to suppliers, clients, and people who had believed in him. He could have declared bankruptcy. He refused. He paid the debts himself, dollar by dollar, until the experience nearly ruined him. That disaster burned one lesson into his mind. When a partnership fails, the person with assets becomes the target. And Wayne had assets, a house, a car, a checking account, a rebuilt credit history. Most importantly, he had a memory he could not ignore. So when two young men came to him with a computer idea, Wayne did not just see opportunity. He saw paperwork. He saw liability. He saw the part of the dream that arrives after the bill comes due. And that is where Apple's origin story turns darker than the legend. At Atari, Wayne met a restless 21-year-old named Steve Jobs. Jobs was intense, impatient, and convinced opportunity rewarded people who moved before everyone else. He did not like waiting for permission. He did not like being slowed down by fear. Jobs also had a brilliant friend named Steve Wozniak. Wozniak was 25, worked at Hewlett-Packard, and built computer boards in his spare time for the joy of engineering. He had created a remarkably elegant personal computer board. Jobs wanted to sell it. Wozniak wanted to share the design freely. One saw a product, one saw a gift. Their arguments needed a referee. One night, Jobs asked Wayne to help settle the dispute between the two young men. Wayne listened, spoke carefully, and helped turn the argument into a company. Then came the offer. Wayne would receive 10% of the new business. Jobs and Wozniak would each hold the rest. On paper, Wayne's job was simple: break deadlocks between two founders who might otherwise fight themselves into paralysis. In reality, he was the adult in the room. On April 1st, 1976, inside Wayne's living room, Apple Computer Company was born. Wozniak's friend Randy Wagenton was present. Wayne sat at his typewriter and drafted the founding agreement himself. It ran 2.5 pages. Jobs signed, Wozniak signed. 3 names created the company that would later change personal technology forever. But the document carried a hidden danger. Apple was not yet a corporation. It was a general partnership. Under California law, that meant company debts could become personal debts for the partners. Jobs had little to lose. Wozniak had little to lose. Wayne did not. He had already lived through the nightmare that young founders rarely imagine. He knew that if things went wrong, creditors would not chase confidence. They would chase money. He saw the trap, and the trap appeared almost immediately. A computer retailer called The Byte Shop placed an order for 50 Apple I computers. The deal was worth about $25,000. Payment would come only when the machines were delivered. To Jobs, this was the breakthrough. Apple had a real customer. The idea was no longer just a board on a workbench. It was a business. But to Wayne, the order looked like a financial cliff. Apple needed parts before it could build anything. Jobs went to Kramer Electronics, a components distributor, and persuaded them to extend $15,000 in parts on 30-day credit. The plan was simple. Use Kramer's parts, build the computers, deliver all 50 machines to the bite shop, collect roughly $25,000, pay Kramer back, keep the difference. It was also fragile. Wayne worried about the bite shop. The store was new, and its owner had a reputation Wayne did not trust for paying bills on schedule. If the retailer delayed payment, Apple would still owe Kramer $15,000. If Apple could not pay, creditors could pursue the partners. All three founders were on paper, but Wayne feared that in practice, they would come for the one partner with something collectible. Jobs was working from his parents' garage. Wozniak was still employed at HP and building after hours. Wayne was the older partner with visible assets. To Jobs, the order looked like momentum. To Wayne, it looked like the opening scene of his failed slot machine business. This was not fear of success. It was fear of debt. And debt had already taught him what optimism costs when the numbers go wrong. On April 12, 1976, only 12 days after drafting Apple's founding agreement, Wayne filed an amendment with the Santa Clara County Registrar's Office. The document removed his 10% stake in Apple Computer Company. Jobs signed it. Wozniak signed it. Nobody stopped him. For walking away, Wayne received $800 in cash. In 1976, that was real money, roughly $4,400 to $4,500 today. But it was not generational money. It was not empire money. It was the price of escaping unlimited liability. He bought his safety. He sold his future. A few months later, the danger passed. The bite shop paid. Apple covered its obligation to Kramer. The company Wayne had feared might collapse survived its first serious test. Then Apple came back into his life. In January 1977, Jobs and Wozniak incorporated the business as Apple Computer Inc. A new investor entered the picture. He was preparing to put in about $250,000 to help the company grow. Now lawyers became involved. Before the new corporation could move forward cleanly, they wanted every loose end tied down. And Ronald Wayne was a loose end. He had written the original partnership agreement. He had worked on the Apple I manual. He had drawn the first Apple logo. He had been a founder, even if only for 12 days. The lawyers wanted him to give up any possible future claim against the company. Apple sent him a release and a check for $1,500. Wayne signed. That brought his total Apple payout to $2,300. That was everything he ever received for the 10% stake he surrendered. Then, the rocket launched. Later in 1977, Apple released the Apple II. The machine helped transform the personal computer from hobbyist experiment into consumer product. In 1980, Apple went public at a valuation around $1.8 billion. Steve Jobs ended that year worth about $217 million on paper. He was 25 years old. Wayne was back at Atari. Same decade, different universe. Here is the famous calculation. If Wayne's original 10% had somehow survived dilution, investment rounds, public markets, and decades of equity changes, it would be worth hundreds of billions on paper today. With Apple trading near a $4 trillion market value, his lost stake becomes one of the most painful numbers in business history. The number is so large, it almost stops feeling real. It becomes a myth, a business school ghost story, a warning whispered to anyone tempted to walk away too early. But Wayne's story is not simple, because the same decision that looks insane from the future looked responsible in the moment. He was not looking at iPhones, MacBooks, app stores, and a near $4 trillion company. He was looking at a young partnership, an unpaid order, $15,000 in parts credit, and two founders with little to lose. The lesson changes depending on where you stand in time. From the future, Wayne looks like the man who sold a kingdom for rent money. From April 1976, he looks like the only person in the room who understood liability. That is the brutal part. Both views can be true, and the punishment did not end with the stock. In the mid-1990s, Wayne was short on cash. He still owned the original Apple founding agreement, the same 2.5-page document he had typed in April 1976. It carried all three signatures: Jobs, Wozniak, Wayne. He sold it to a manuscript dealer for $500. That document later changed hands. In 2011, it reached Sotheby's. The auction estimate was $150,000. The final price was $1.6 million. The winning bidder was a billionaire from Miami. Wayne received nothing from that auction. He had already sold the paper cleanly for $500. One more fortune passed through his hands as paper. Ronald Wayne eventually settled into a quiet life in Pahrump, Nevada. He sold stamps and rare coins from his home. He played penny slots at a local casino. The first Apple product he ever owned was an iPad 2, given to him at a conference. Reporters kept asking the obvious question: did he regret it? Wayne's answers stayed calm. He said remaining at Apple would likely have made him the documentation man, writing manuals and handling logistics, while Jobs and Wozniak pushed history forward. He believed the pressure of keeping pace with two young founders would have consumed him. He described himself as standing in the shadow of giants. He also said he might have become the richest man in the cemetery. That line is the key to the whole story, because everyone wants the $400 billion version. Everyone wants to imagine they would have held on. Everyone wants to believe they would have seen what Apple would become. But Wayne did not have the luxury of hindsight. He had a scar from 1971. He had legal exposure. He had assets to protect. He had a contract that made him personally vulnerable if the company failed. And he had two partners who could chase the upside because the downside would not hit them the same way. Risk is not shared equally. That is what the legend usually misses. To Jobs, risk was fuel. To Wozniak, the computer was craft. To Wayne, the paperwork was a loaded weapon. None of them were completely wrong. Jobs needed unreasonable belief. Wozniak needed the freedom to build. Wayne needed to survive. The tragedy is that Apple required exactly the kind of risk Wayne had already learned never to take again. And history rewarded the risk-takers so violently that caution began to look like stupidity. But caution was not stupidity. Caution was debt. Caution was knowing that when a partnership collapses, the dreamers may walk away, but the creditors look for the person with a house. This is why Ronald Wayne's story still hurts. It is not just a story about missing wealth. It is a story about how the same decision can be wise in the present and devastating in the future. It is a story about timing, liability, and the unbearable unfairness of hindsight. Wayne did not sell Apple because he lacked intelligence. He sold because he understood a danger the others could ignore. And for 12 days, that understanding made him the safest founder at Apple. Then, time turned safety into one of the most expensive decisions ever made. Ronald Wayne was not crushed by a bad idea. He was crushed by a good decision that history made look unforgivable. He did not lose Apple because he failed to dream. He lost it because he was the only founder who knew what a nightmare could cost.